Alright guys, now we are on to the Hierophant. The Hierophant is so much a card of tradition and doing things the way that we've always done them, and kind of like a rigid social structure. So how I learned this card was I just allowed myself to be the Hierophant and to feel what it feels like to be in that sort of organization, like a religious organization, because although this card doesn't have to specifically represent a religious organization, it does represent organizations of power and authority that have stood for a very long time. So when I move into this card, in my body, it feels like being part of something, being part of some sort of organization, or maybe religious, maybe it's not, but some sort of organization or structure that has been around for a very long time, that has specific rules and regulations. It has specific ways of doing things. It has specific beliefs about how things need to happen, the way that they need to go. In fact, there's a whole book written on what you need to do and how you need to do it, right? Like literally, if we're talking about organized religion. It feels to me very much like long-standing power and authority, right? Very rigid, very like, this is what it is, okay? So this card very much represents like the conventional way of doing things, the way they've been done for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, right? This is the standard, this is what's happening. There's no wiggle room for doing it a new way or inventing anything, right? Like we're not adding anything to the ritual, right? We're going to do the ritual the way they did it, 1,000 years ago, and that's what's going to happen here. And if you don't like that, that's too bad. It feels to me like that sort of energy of tradition, ritual, almost like blind following. So when I move into these cards, it feels like everyone is just blindly following what everyone else has done before. There's no thinking, there's no questioning, there's no creativity, like there's no room for that. It's just, this is the structure, you're fitting into the structure and you're not changing it, right? It feels very rigid. Rigid is the word, right? The other thing that feels it feels like to me is like conformity. You better conform, you better do what we're going to tell you, and you better do it the way we told you to do it. Or else, like there is no other option, right? One path, no deviations in said path. So this can represent a religious organization. It doesn't have to. It can represent any sort of religion, any sort of organization that has those sort of structures in place, that sort of thinking in place, right? So in the Druid Craft Tarot, it is the High Priestess card instead of the Hierophant, right? So in some decks it will be the High Priest. Did I just say High Priestess? I meant High Priest. So when I tune into this deck, it feels just so much more nature oriented to me. So you have to use your intuition with whatever deck you're using, right? Like if I got this card, I might, if it intuitively came to me that I should interpret the card as long-standing, traditional, conformist organization, then I would do that. But if it came to me that I should interpret this more as the High Priest being in tune with nature and using nature as his guide, then I would do that. Now, is that the traditional representation of this card? No, it's not. But you should use your intuition always, 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 always first and foremost, right? The whole point of using tarot cards is to allow it to be a door into your intuition, into your psychic mind, into your intuitive mind, into your clairvoyance, and to allow the information from spirit to move through you so that you can give an effective reading to whoever it is you're reading for, whether it's yourself or somebody else, okay? The point of tarot is not to be stuck hard or rigid like this card in your reading, okay? Allow it to flow. Allow what comes to you to come to you, right? If you get the High Priest because you're using a deck that's more nature oriented like this one, then go with that, right? Like trust that this was the card that needed to come up and this is what it means, right? And if you needed to get a card that was more stuck hard or rigid like this, then you would have used that deck, right? So always trust what you're doing. Trust what card deck you're led to when you're going to do a reading. Trust the card that comes up and trust what your intuition is telling you, right? Don't let your ego mind override what your intuition is saying. So if you get the High Priest card and you look at it, and when I look at this card, I don't feel very much about the hard, stuck, rigid, long-standing social structure. Actually, honestly, this card really makes me feel like, whoop, whoop. It makes me feel like the Catholic Church. Like, that's what I get from this card, right? But I don't get that from this card. So if I were using this second eye reading, I would feel into how this feels for me, right? This feels to me like being in tune with nature, right? Being the masculine force for nature. And if I'm moving into the high priest, and I'm moving into a couple thousand years ago when it was normal to have the high priest, you know, the high priest would, you know, not only commune with the divine, but I feel like the high priest would come back with a more sort of solid structure and like a solid plan, more so than what the high priestess would have come up with, right? The high priestess probably would have come up with like something feeling based and something maybe to do with meditation or something more like self-care or taking a bubble bath or something, right? The high priest, he would have come up with some much more concrete action plan, like, okay, when the new moon does this, you do that, right? Like, when you see a hawk fly overhead, then that's a sign that da-da-da-da, right? It feels to me more, more concrete, more established. A lot of times the high priest would have done ritual just like the high priestess would, but he probably would have followed ritual that was passed down from experience and knowledge of working with the elements and working with the animals and working with the stones and working with your environment, right? That's what I get from this card. Whereas this card feels like knowledge passed down because somebody told me to 2,000 years ago, and now we're just going to keep doing the same thing, right? Like, that's what this card feels like. The High Priest card feels like, oh, well, I'm going to follow this and I'm going to do this ritual because it is in communication with the elements, and it is in communication with, you know, nature, and we're doing it because it's in alignment, right? Like, it was in alignment when we did it hundreds of years ago. It's still in alignment today, which is why we're doing it. And this card feels to me more like I remember the purpose of why I'm doing it, right? Like, I know why I'm using the certain elements. I know why I'm using the element of fire. I know why I'm using the element of the swords and the cups, right? Right? I know I am doing those things. It has been passed down tradition-wise from high priest to high priest to high priest. And when I move into this card, it also feels like you have the ability to explore on your own and learn things on your own, and more of the emphasis is put on learning these things for yourself, as well as learning the traditional ways of doing things at the same time, right? So the things that have been passed down from the father to the son, very important, but also, like, you're allowed to have you-ness, right? You are allowed to, like, be in there. Whereas this structure is so rigid, there's no you allowed, right? There is just the church, and you don't get to, like, be a snowflake in the church. Nope, you get to be exactly what they tell you to be, okay? This, yeah, I'm just not really in harmony with a lot of energy like this. But it is what it is, right? It's just an archetype of energy. It's just a field of information. It's just giving you information. And it's just showing you that if this card comes up in a reading, it has the principles, it has the practices, it has the feeling of a sort of organized religious type of structure. So if it comes up in a reading, you've got to feel what that means. What is your intuition telling you it means? Is it meaning a job? Is it meaning a organization the person has been in for a long time, or like a club that they've been in, or does it literally mean the church, right? It could mean all these things, or it could mean just somebody that maybe has a lot of narrow-mindedness. It could be a person, but you have to use your intuition as to what it actually means. Most of the time when I get one of the court cards, I will take that to mean that it's like a person or a personality. But if I'm getting this card and I specifically feel like it's a person, I'm going to follow my gut. I'm going to follow my gut, and I'm going to go into the personality types of that person. Okay? So it's very, very, very much allowing what feels right inside of you to come through. Alright? And if you get this card, trust it and feel into the energy of what it means to you. Alright, if I'm going to go into the reverse energy of the Hierophant, what it feels like to me is breaking the rules. It feels like doing what I've been forbidden to do or that I shouldn't do according to the rules of the structured, rigid organization. It feels like not following the crowd. It feels like doing something different than everybody else, right? It feels to me like ingenuity, totally thinking out of the box, coming up with a total new way of doing something that somebody like this could have never thought of, right? It feels like dancing to your own beat, dancing to your own drum, and not the drum of the restricted organization, but to what feels right inside of you, in your intuition, in your guidance, and ignoring social norms, social structures, or what anybody else tells you, or even what maybe the practice, beliefs, or ways of doing things are for your industry, right? It could be doing things totally different than your industry. Doing things that nobody's thought of before, right? Doing them in a new way, an avant-garde way, a fresh way, right? Now, if I were to look at the High Priest card and I were to reverse the energy, it feels like doing things the tribe doesn't accept, doing things the tribe doesn't think you should do, going against what they are counseling you to do. And it almost feels to me like, maybe that's not such a good thing to do, like maybe that's kind of an unsafe thing. And I feel that in regards to this card specifically, because this card feels very much more like 2,000 years ago, we're living in the forest, right? We're a tribe of people, and it was very much in your best interest to like go with the tribe because you would be protected that way, right? And you'd be with them. But to do something that the tribe wasn't really going to agree with, well, that could have some repercussions and some consequences. And it just doesn't feel safe. Whereas when I move into this card, I guess you could interpret it as, well, it's not safe to do that. It's not safe to leave the organization, whatever. But what it feels to me is like, oh, well, it's like a new way of doing things. Of course we need to move forward. Of course we need to do something new. Of course we need to not do things the way they've always been done. Because the way they've always been done is so rigid, and it feels so much like indoctrination that it's like stifling, right? Whereas, because this has so much more tribal energy in it, it doesn't, being part of the tribe and doing the traditions of past, it doesn't feel stifling. It actually feels nourishing. All right, so these are different ways that you can interpret the High Priest or the Hierophant card, and I just want you guys to make sure you're really tuned into your intuition and what feels good to you and what's coming through you, and trust that. And if what comes through you isn't what the quote-unquote traditional meaning is, then discard it, right? So yeah, that's what I've got to say about the Hierophant.